The streets of the city hummed with the steady pulse of the night. It was late, and the air had a bite to it, carrying the distant sound of traffic and the occasional rustle of wind between darkened alleys. The neon lights of storefronts and street lamps flickered, casting long shadows across the road. It was the kind of night that made every turn feel like it could hold danger, even if it was just a shadow. Officer Michael Donovan's headlights cut through the night as he cruised down a quiet stretch of road. He'd been patrolling these streets for years, each inch of pavement now etched into his memory, every corner with its own story. It was routine. He wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary, but then he saw the car. A sleek black sit-in, cruising along a little too slowly, weaving just a bit too much. Donovan's instincts kicked in. He hadn't seen anything explicitly wrong, but his gut told him something was off. As an experienced officer, he'd learned to trust those instincts. He flicked on the sirens, the sharp sound echoing in the night air. The sit-in's brake lights flashed, and it pulled over to the side of the road. Donovan slowed, parked his patrol car behind the sit-in, and killed the engine. The silence that followed felt heavy, pressing against the both of them, the sound of his breathing somehow loud in his ears. He stepped out of the car and approached the sit-in, his boots making a soft sound on the pavement. The driver's side window rolled down, revealing a calm, collected man sitting behind the wheel. His face was unreadable, his expression composed. Donovan leaned in slightly, his badge gleaming in the dim light. "Good evening, sir," he said, his voice low but firm. "Do you know why I stopped you tonight?" The man didn't flinch. He met Donovan's gaze, his own calm and steady. "No, officer." "Can't say I do." Donovan took a step back, his eyes scanning the vehicle. "Your right headlight's out. That's why I pulled you over." The man nodded slightly, but his eyes never wavered from Donovan's. "It's been on the list to fix. Haven't had the time." A quick scan of the man's face, then Donovan moved closer, leaning just enough to put a bit of pressure on the situation. "Where are you headed tonight?" he asked, his tone sharp and deliberate. The driver didn't respond immediately. Instead, he seemed to consider the question before offering a simple home. "Where's home?" Donovan pressed, his gaze narrowing slightly as if trying to catch a glimpse of something more. He was looking for a crack in the man's calm, a hint of hesitation, something to latch onto. The man's eyes held steady, unmoving. Not far. Donovan noticed the slight rise of the man's hand as it rested on the steering wheel. He watched the fingers flex, a subtle motion, as if the man was holding something back. He could feel the tension in the air now, thick and suffocating. It was like a challenge. "Mind if I take a look in your car?" Donovan asked, his voice still polite but with a tinge of authority, the request now a command more than anything. The driver's response was immediate but calm. "I don't believe I'm required to let you search my vehicle, officer." Donovan smiled thinly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Not required, no. But you've got a broken headlight. That's enough for me to take a look. I don't know, maybe there's more you're hiding." The man leaned back slightly in his seat, not fazed in the slightest. "If you say so." Donovan paused for a beat, allowing the tension to hang between them. It was the kind of standoff that could break either way. His hand moved towards his belt, pulling out his flashlight and flicking it on. The beam sliced through the darkness as he moved around the back of the car, peering inside the rear windows. He could see nothing out of the ordinary, but his gut told him there was something about this situation that didn't sit right. "Anything I should know about?" Donovan asked, his voice slipping into a quieter, more probing tone, the kind he perfected over years of dealing with people who thought they could outsmart him. The man didn't answer right away, but his eyes flickered, just for a second, towards the glove compartment. It was subtle, but Donovan caught it. His pulse quickened just slightly. The moment stretched, the tension thick enough to slice. Donovan circled around to the passenger side, his gaze never leaving the man. "I'm gonna have to ask you to step out of the car," he said finally, his voice cool, but with an edge that suggested this was more than just a simple stop. The man didn't respond immediately, and for a heartbeat, the air felt still. Then, slowly, he reached for the door handle and opened it. As he stood, The length of his body unfolded with a controlled grace, and Donovan couldn't help but notice how the man's posture seemed to shift, like he was suddenly aware of the power dynamics in play. Donovan's grip tightened around the flashlight. His instincts screamed that this wasn't just a simple traffic stop. Something deeper was at play. He watched as the man stepped onto the sidewalk, his eyes now locked firmly on Donovan's. "You got a problem with me?" the man asked, his voice smooth but laced with a challenging undertone. He was sizing Donovan up, gauging the moment. "No problem," Donovan said, keeping his voice steady. "But I do have a job to do." The man didn't flinch at the words, but there was a slight shift in his expression, something colder now. His eyes narrowed as if he was seeing through Donovan, reading him. "I think you're making a mistake, officer." There was something about that phrase, something that made Donovan's chest tighten. He didn't know why, but the man's calmness, his unwavering confidence, was like a warning bell ringing in the back of his mind. "We'll see about that," Donovan replied, his voice low and controlled. "Let's just get this over with." The man tilted his head slightly, as if pondering the situation. Then, without warning, he straightened, his posture rigid. "I think it's time you knew who I am," he said, his voice dropping just enough to make the words feel significant. Donovan narrowed his eyes, his body language tense. The air around them felt heavy, as if the world itself was waiting for something. The man took a deep breath, his expression hardening as he spoke the words that would change everything. "I'm the head of internal affairs." A chill ran down Donovan's spine as the weight of the statement sank in. The world seemed to pause, suspended in a moment of silence, as if the universe had just shifted. Donovan didn't react outwardly, but his mind raced, searching for the implications. The head of internal affairs. This wasn't just some ordinary civilian he'd stopped. This was someone with power, with connections, and now with leverage. For the first time that night, Donovan's calm began to crack. The stakes had just changed. The tension between them deepened. The rules of this encounter had shifted, and Donovan knew that whatever happened next, it wouldn't be just a simple stop anymore. It was a battle for control. The silence between them hung thick, broken only by the faint rustling of wind against the trees lining the road. Donovan stood just a little taller now, the weight of the situation pressing down on him like the gravity of a storm waiting to break. The man in front of him, the one who had casually dropped the bombshell about being the head of internal affairs, was still calm, still composed, as if this was just another mundane interaction for him. The flickering streetlight above seemed to cast long, distorted shadows over their faces, heightening the surreal tension. Donovan could feel his pulse picking up, his stomach tightening, and the slow simmer of anger bubbling up from somewhere deep inside. How dare this guy stand there, calm as can be, treating this like some bureaucratic exchange, as if the badge Donovan wore didn't hold weight, as if he didn't have the power here. He had to regain control. He had to. Donovan stepped closer, narrowing the distance between them. His eyes were cold now, his voice low, almost menacing. "I don't think you understand the position you're in," he said, his words carrying a threat that lingered in the air. "You can't talk to me like this. You don't know who I am, what I can do." The driver, Michael, Donovan had just caught his name from his ID, remained as steady as a rock, his expression unwavering. "I understand perfectly, officer," he said quietly, without a hint of fear or hesitation. "But what you're not understanding is that I don't need to explain myself to you." That was it. The calmness in the man's voice. It was driving Donovan insane. The fact that Michael wasn't cowering, wasn't showing the slightest hint of worry, struck at something in Donovan. His authority felt challenged, bruised. His hands clenched at his sides, his fingers brushing against the cold metal of his radio. Just a little more pressure, he thought. One more push, and I can make him bend. Show him who's in charge. Without thinking, Donovan reached for his handcuffs, the metallic click of them pulling free from his belt echoing into the quiet night. "I've had enough of your attitude." Donovan spat, his jaw tight. "I'm arresting you for resisting. You're clearly trying to escalate this, and I'm not having it." Michael raised a brow, as though Donovan's move was as predictable as it was unnecessary. "Arrest me," he asked, his voice almost amused. On what charge? Donovan ignored the question, already reaching for Michael's arm. His fingers closed around his wrist with more force than necessary, a sharp touch. You're not in a position to tell me what I can and can't do. Now I'm asking you one last time, are you going to make this easy for yourself? The words were cold, calculated, meant to break Michael's resolve, to remind him who held the power in this interaction. Donovan's pulse quickened as the anger in his chest surged, the brief flare of frustration settling into something darker, more dangerous. Michael stood tall, unyielding. The man was unshakable, but Donovan wasn't ready to back down. You think you can talk to me like that? You think your badge makes you untouchable? Let go of my arm now, Michael repeated, his tone clipped but authoritative. His voice had an edge now, a quiet warning that Donovan didn't catch. Too lost in his own rage. Donovan's eyes narrowed, the sweat at his temple beginning to bead. This was supposed to be over by now. It was supposed to be just another routine stop. But this man, this arrogant man, had twisted it into something else. Not until I've seen your ID again, Donovan growled. I don't care who you think you are. You're not above the law. Now move, he snapped. But before Donovan could take further action, Michael's hand shot up, his palm facing out in a slow, deliberate motion. Do not touch me again, Michael said, each word heavy with a quiet power. The officer froze, staring at the man's hand. It was a strange gesture, slow, but it held weight, an unspoken command. And for the first time that night, Donovan hesitated. A flicker of doubt crossed his mind. Michael took a step back, his posture still perfect. He moved with deliberate calm, as though the whole situation had shifted into his favor. I'm going to ask you one more time, officer, Michael said, his voice still low and smooth. Do you want to escalate this further? Because you're dangerously close to making a very costly mistake. Donovan's grip on Michael's arm loosened just slightly, his breath coming in quick, sharp bursts. There was something unsettling in Michael's tone now, something that sent a shiver down his spine. Costly mistake? I don't think you understand, Donovan said, taking another step toward him, trying to regain the upper hand. I'm a police officer. I'm the one who decides what's a mistake. You're just another guy trying to make me look weak. You'll regret this. The words were out before he could stop them, and as soon as they left his mouth, he felt the weight of the lie. He knew he was wrong. He knew he was. There was something in Michael's eyes now, something that was far more than the ordinary citizen. I think you've already made your mistake, officer, Michael said, his gaze hardening. His voice was barely above a whisper now, yet it rang out like a thunderclap. You're not going to like the consequences when you realize who you're dealing with. The air between them thickened, oppressive. Donovan opened his mouth to speak, to defend himself, but for the first time that night, words failed him. The reality of what he had just done was beginning to settle in, the realization hitting him slowly. This wasn't just any traffic stop. The faintest glint of fear flickered in Donovan's eyes, just for a moment. He stepped back, his mind racing. What do you mean? He asked, his voice low, the sharp edge now gone, replaced with something more uncertain. Michael didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket with a slow, controlled motion. The officer tensed, preparing himself for anything, another confrontation, maybe a weapon, anything. But when Michael withdrew his hand, it was empty. Instead, he pulled out his badge, flipping it open with deliberate care, allowing Donovan just a moment to see it. The shiny emblem gleamed under the streetlight. I think we've reached the point where you should know who I really am, Michael said, his voice soft but final. I'm the head of internal affairs. Donovan's heart skipped a beat. His chest constricted, and for the first time, he realized just how badly he had miscalculated. In the quiet, Michael's words echoed, their meaning settling in like a stone. Donovan had just made the biggest mistake of his career, and he hadn't even known it yet. The moment hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Donovan's gaze locked on the badge Michael had casually flipped open, the gleaming metal reflecting the streetlight with an almost cold precision. For a second, Donovan couldn't breathe, couldn't move, as the weight of what he had just done hit him like a sledgehammer. The badge, the emblem, it didn't just signify a man of power. It represented everything he had miscalculated. Michael's face was unreadable, but Donovan could see the quiet satisfaction in his eyes, a look that said he'd been waiting for this, waiting for Donovan to realize the mistake. And now Donovan knew. He hadn't just pulled over some random person. He hadn't just pushed around an ordinary citizen. He had tried to arrest the head of internal affairs. The color drained from Donovan's face, his breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. The words tumbled out of his mouth before he could stop them, stammering, desperate. I didn't know. I didn't realize. I thought. Michael's lips curled into a thin smile, but there was no humor in it. Just cold, unyielding power. You thought you could bully someone just because you wore a badge? Because you think you're untouchable. Donovan's mind raced, trying to pull together any semblance of control, but it was slipping through his fingers. He could feel the weight of his career slipping away like sand through an hourglass too fast to catch. His throat tightened, words failing him as he tried to recover. I'm sorry, Donovan said quickly, his voice trembling. I made a mistake. Please? Michael held up a hand, cutting him off. You made more than a mistake, officer, he said, his voice calm but firm. You violated protocol. You violated my rights, and you did so with the full force of your position. Donovan opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He could feel the panic rising in his chest and the dread that followed. He had no idea how badly this was about to spiral. Then Michael took a step forward, his eyes narrowing, his voice steady and commanding. You understand you've just committed a crime, don't you? Donovan's heart raced. Well, what? His mind couldn't process the words fast enough. He didn't even realize that he had broken the law. Michael's eyes didn't leave his. Where's your body camera, officer? Is it on? Or did you conveniently forget about that too? He asked, each word dripping with authority. Tell me, how many times have you done this before? How many people have you harassed, mistreated, or falsely arrested while hiding behind your badge? The words stung more than Donovan could admit. He didn't have an answer. He couldn't even remember the last time he truly questioned his actions as an officer. But now, with the realization dawning on him that he had just made the gravest mistake of his career, the questions gnawed at him with terrifying clarity. A sound in the distance caught his attention. The flashing lights of another squad car approaching sent a wave of dread washing over him. A second officer stepped out of the vehicle, a woman, her eyes immediately scanning the scene. Donovan felt his stomach sink. She could tell. The woman glanced at Michael, then back at Donovan, narrowing her eyes. What the hell is going on here, Mike? She asked, her voice firm but cautious. You're pulling rank again? Michael turned to face her, his posture relaxed, but his words were cutting. I'm not pulling rank, Ellie. I'm making sure this officer doesn't get away with making a huge mistake. Ellie looked at Donovan, her expression hardening. You're in trouble, aren't you, Donovan? She said flatly, her gaze sharpening. Do you even realize who you've just tried to arrest? Donovan's face flushed, his mind racing to make sense of the situation. He couldn't deny it anymore. His entire world was crumbling before him. His badge, his authority, everything he had built, it was all slipping away. This wasn't just an error in judgment. It was a career-ending blunder. Michael was right. Donovan had abused his position, tried to enforce power where it wasn't his to take. The shame was almost too much to bear. We're done here, Michael said, his voice cutting through the tension. He turned to Ellie, nodding briefly. I'll take care of this. Make sure the right people are notified. Ellie gave a nod, not bothering to argue. She had already seen enough. I'll make sure it's handled. You need to go. Now, without another word, she climbed back into her car and drove off, leaving Donovan standing there, rooted to the spot as Michael stepped back toward his vehicle. Michael's voice was low, but it carried with authority. You got lucky tonight, Donovan. You think you can get away with everything because you wear that badge, but badges don't make you better than anyone. They just make you more responsible. Donovan's mouth went dry. The finality in Michael's words hit him like a slap in the face. He was done. The sound of Michael's car engine revving brought him back to reality. Michael didn't look back as he pulled away, the sleek black sea vanishing into the night. For a long moment, Donovan stood alone, the weight of his failure sinking in with every passing second. He could already hear the whispers in the department, the judgment from his colleagues, the impending investigation. The consequences were coming. There was no way out now. The thought of losing everything, the badge, the career he had worked so hard to build, was almost too much to bear. But as Michael's car disappeared into the distance, the last words from him echoed in Donovan's mind, a final reminder of everything he had failed to understand. Today you got lucky, but what if I wasn't who I am? What if you made that mistake with someone who didn't have the power to make sure you didn't get away with it? Donovan swallowed hard. He was already imagining the headlines, the calls from internal affairs, the lawyers, and the inevitable disciplinary hearing that awaited him. The words would follow him long after the moment had passed, reminding him that in the end, justice didn't care about the uniform, and it certainly didn't care about the mistakes you thought you could get away with. The car was gone now, and all that remained was the bitter reality of his actions, and the knowledge that his world had just come crashing down.